When Sophia finally finished her little speech about standards and presentation, her smile lingered just a second too long, like she was waiting for applause, but the room stayed quiet, and that was when I gently set my fork down and reached into my handbag, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, the way you do when you know the moment belongs to you now. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice calm enough that a few heads turned, surprised I was speaking at all. "This atmosphere isn't mine anymore." And then I slid the envelope across the table toward Daniel, watching his confusion bloom as he opened it, his fingers slowing when he recognized the letterhead, the legal stamp, the signatures he'd ignored months ago when I first tried to explain. "What is this?" he asked, but his voice already sounded smaller, thinner, and Sophia leaned in, her polished confidence cracking just enough for me to see the first flicker of fear in her eyes as Daniel read the words that changed everything: the transfer of ownership, the clause his father had insisted on before he passed, the one that made me sole trustee of every asset tied to this house, this land, and the company that paid for every inch of the life they were so proud to curate. "That's the updated estate structure," I said quietly, folding my hands in front of me. "The one that went into effect the moment I signed the final documents last week." And I let that settle, let the silence stretch until it pressed against their throats. "You mean?" Daniel started, but he couldn't finish because he already understood, and Sophia's chair scraped slightly as she shifted, her composure slipping in small telling pieces. "I mean," I continued, meeting her gaze for the first time that night, "that the house you've been redesigning, the dinners you've been hosting, the atmosphere you've been so carefully curating, none of it belongs to you." Her lips parted, ready to argue, to dismiss, but I wasn't done, not yet. "And the financial accounts you've been using," I added, letting the words land softer but sharper. "The ones Daniel thought were family funds, they've already been flagged." Daniel's head snapped up, his face draining of color as he looked at her, really looked this time, and I could see it clicking into place: the unexplained transfers, the renovation costs that never quite added up, the quiet calls he must have ignored. "That's not true," Sophia said quickly, too quickly, her voice losing that polished edge, and I simply slid another document across the table, this one thinner, colder, stamped in a way that left no room for interpretation. "It is," I said. "And by tomorrow morning it will also be official." The word hung there, official, heavy with everything it implied. Legal reviews, frozen accounts, investigations that didn't care about dinner parties or curated atmospheres. Someone at the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably. Another guest lowered their glass, the illusion cracking all around her. "You embarrassed me the moment I walked in," I said, my tone never rising, never breaking. "But you've been embarrassing yourselves for a long time." Daniel stood up halfway, as if he might say something, fix something, but there was nothing left to fix, not anymore. "Mom?" he started, but I shook my head. Gently, not angry, not bitter, just finished. "No," I said. "You made your choices." And then I stood, smoothing the fabric of the dress she had dismissed so easily, feeling the weight of the room shift with me, not because I demanded it, but because I no longer needed anything from them. Sophia didn't speak again, her silence louder than any insult she'd thrown, her perfect image unraveling under the quiet certainty of consequences she couldn't charm her way out of. And Daniel, he just stood there, holding papers that proved exactly how little control he'd had all along. I picked up my coat, pausing only long enough to look at the table, at the setting that had never been meant for me, and I smiled, not the polite smile I'd worn all evening, but something steadier, something final. "Enjoy the atmosphere," I said, and then I walked out of that house with everything that mattered already back where it belonged, leaving behind a silence they would never be able to dress up again. "Your style doesn't fit our atmosphere," my daughter-in-law said the moment I stepped through the door, her voice light, almost pleasant, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of dismissing me from my own son's Thanksgiving dinner. And for a second I thought I had misheard her, that maybe the long drive or the early November chill had made my ears unreliable, but then I saw the way she looked at me, not angry, not even openly rude, just measured, assessing, like I was a piece of furniture that didn't belong in the room she had carefully arranged, and I understood exactly what she meant. I smiled, the kind of small, polite smile you give when you don't intend to argue, and stepped inside anyway, setting my casserole dish on the marble kitchen island that hadn't been there the last time I visited. Because everything about this house felt different now, brighter in a way that was almost cold, as if warmth had been edited out on purpose. "I'm glad you're here," I told myself silently, the same way I used to reassure my son when he was little and afraid of thunderstorms, and I let my eyes move slowly across the room, taking in the details, the tall glass vases, the carefully arranged place settings, the guests dressed in muted tones that seemed to follow an unspoken rule I hadn't been given. I had stood in front of my closet for nearly 30 minutes that morning, choosing a dress I thought was elegant, a soft blue one my late husband had always liked, pressing it carefully, pairing it with a simple necklace, telling myself this was just a family dinner, that I didn't need to overthink it, that being there mattered more than how I looked. But standing there now, under the quiet weight of unfamiliar eyes, I felt something shift inside me, subtle but undeniable, like stepping into a room where a conversation had already started without you. Daniel appeared from the dining area, his smile quick, distracted, his attention already split between me and whatever Sophia had planned for the evening, and he kissed my cheek with the same absent affection he used when he was rushing out the door for work. "Mom, you made it," he said, as if there had been a chance I wouldn't. As if I hadn't driven 45 miles in holiday traffic with a dish he used to request every year when he was a boy. "Of course I did," I replied, gently smoothing my sleeve, pretending I didn't notice how his eyes flicked briefly to my outfit before returning to his wife, as if he were silently checking whether I fit into something I hadn't known I needed to match. I followed him into the dining room where laughter rose and fell in soft, controlled waves, and for a moment I almost convinced myself I was imagining things, that families change, that people grow, that maybe this was just what adulthood looked like now, polished and distant. But then I noticed the seating arrangement, the way every place card was positioned with intention, and mine set slightly off to the side, not at the center where I used to sit when I hosted holidays in my own home, but near the end, close enough to be included, far enough to be forgotten. And I felt that same quiet shift again, deeper this time, settling somewhere in my chest. I took my seat without comment, folding my hands in my lap for a brief second before reaching for the water glass, grounding myself in small familiar motions, because that's what you do when something feels off but no one else is acknowledging it. You stay composed, you observe, you wait, and as Sophia moved gracefully around the table, directing the flow of the evening with a confidence that suggested she had rehearsed every detail, I realized this wasn't just a dinner, it was a performance, and I had walked in without a script. I adjusted my posture, lifted my chin just slightly, and let my gaze settle calmly on the table in front of me, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that silence can be a kind of power, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply stay long enough to understand what game is being played before you decide how to respond. I sat there with my hands folded loosely in my lap, listening to the soft clink of silverware and the carefully measured laughter that seemed to rise and fall at just the right moments, and it struck me how different this felt from the Thanksgivings I used to host, when the kitchen was too warm and someone always talked over someone else and Daniel would sneak a taste of the stuffing before it even made it to the table. But here everything was controlled, polished, almost staged, as if spontaneity had been quietly removed along with anything that did not match the aesthetic Sophia had built around herself. I reached for my water glass again, taking a small sip, just to have something to do with my hands, and let my eyes move across the table, noticing how every detail seemed intentional, from the neutral color palette of the linens to the way the candles were spaced evenly down the center, even the food itself arranged like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than a family gathering, and for a brief moment I wondered if I had missed something important, some message or expectation that had been communicated to everyone except me. The woman seated across from me smiled politely and asked where I had driven from, her tone kind but distant, and when I answered, she nodded as if checking off a box in a conversation she had already planned, before turning her attention back to Sophia, who stood near the head of the table, guiding the evening with a confidence that left no room for interruption. Daniel barely looked in my direction again, not out of cruelty, I told myself, but out of habit, as though his attention now belonged to a different orbit, one that did not include me in the way it used to, and I felt that realization settle quietly, not as a sharp pain, but as something heavier, something that spread slowly through my chest. I remembered how I had woken up early that morning, before the sun had fully risen, standing in my small kitchen measuring ingredients the way I always had, carefully following the same recipe I had used for over 30 years, the one Daniel used to call his favorite, and I had smiled to myself then, imagining him taking the first bite, saying it tasted just like he remembered, but now the dish sat untouched among the others, blending in so completely that no one seemed to notice it had come from me at all. Sophia moved closer to the table, placing her hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder as she spoke to the guests, her voice smooth and practiced, and I watched the way he leaned slightly toward her without thinking, the way his body responded to her presence, and I realized this was not something sudden, not something that had happened overnight, but something that had been building quietly over time, layer by layer, until the version of our family I remembered had been replaced by something else entirely. I adjusted the napkin in my lap, smoothing it carefully, and allowed myself to breathe slowly, because there was no scene to make, no argument to win, only a truth that was beginning to reveal itself piece by piece. And as I sat there, surrounded by people who all seemed to understand their roles except me, I began to see the pattern more clearly, the subtle exclusions, the unspoken rules, the quiet ways I had been moved to the edge without ever being told I no longer belonged at the center. And for the first time that evening, I stopped trying to find my place within it. The first crack did not come from anything loud or obvious. It came from a small moment that most people at that table would have missed entirely, the kind of moment that slips between words and settles quietly in the space where meaning lives. And I might have missed it too if I had not already been paying such careful attention. Sophia leaned slightly toward the woman beside her, lowering her voice just enough to suggest privacy but not enough to prevent it from carrying across the table. And I heard my own name spoken with a softness that was not kindness but calculation, followed by a light laugh that did not belong to me. I did not turn my head, I did not interrupt, I simply let the sound reach me and pass through me, the way you do when you realize the conversation was never meant for you in the first place. She still thinks it is the same as it used to be, Sophia said, her tone gentle, almost sympathetic, but the words themselves carried a different weight, one that settled in my chest with a clarity I could not ignore. And the woman beside her murmured something in response that I could not fully hear, but the glance they shared told me enough. I picked up my fork, cutting into the food on my plate even though I could not remember tasting any of it, and focused instead on the rhythm of the movement, steady, controlled, because sometimes control begins with the smallest things. Daniel laughed at something someone else said. A genuine laugh this time, and for a moment I looked at him the way I used to, searching for the boy who once needed me for everything. But all I saw was a man who had learned to exist comfortably in a world that had quietly adjusted itself around someone else's expectations. I wondered then when the shift had truly begun, not tonight, not even this year, but sometime earlier, in the small decisions that seemed harmless at the time. The holidays moved, the traditions adjusted, the visits shortened, each one explained away with reasonable words until the pattern became invisible. We like to keep things consistent, Sophia continued, her voice rising just enough to include the table again, and I noticed how the guests nodded, how easily they accepted her version of what this gathering was supposed to be, as if consistency mattered more than connection. I felt no anger, not yet, only a quiet recognition that settled deeper with each passing minute, a realization that I had been adjusting myself for years without noticing, making space, stepping back, believing it was temporary, believing it was kindness, when in truth it had been something else entirely. I set my fork down again, resting my hands lightly against the edge of the table, and allowed my gaze to move once more across the room, taking in the details I had overlooked before, the absence of anything that reflected me, not a photograph, not a memory, not a trace of the life that had once filled this space when it was still connected to mine. It was not just that I did not belong here tonight, it was that this version of their world had been built carefully, intentionally, without leaving room for me at all. And in that moment, as the conversation continued around me and the evening carried on as if nothing were wrong, I stopped searching for a way to fit into it and began, quietly, to understand exactly what had been taken from me, and more importantly, what I was no longer willing to give away. The realization did not come all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a thread being pulled loose from a fabric I had trusted for years, and as I sat there listening to the low hum of conversation that no longer included me, my mind drifted backward, not to anything dramatic, but to the quiet moments I had dismissed at the time, the ones that now felt different when I looked at them again. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after Daniel got married, how I had asked what time I should arrive, and Sophia had smiled warmly before saying they were keeping things small that year, just something simple, and I had accepted that without question, reheating leftovers alone in my kitchen while imagining they were building their own traditions, something every young couple deserved, or so I had told myself. Then there was the Christmas when the invitation came late, almost as an afterthought, with a carefully worded message about limited space, about wanting an intimate setting, and I had adjusted again, arriving with a smaller gift, staying a shorter time, telling myself it was not about me, that love did not need to be measured in hours or seats at a table. I thought about the way Daniel's calls had become shorter over the years, how he would promise to visit but something would always come up, a work commitment, a last-minute plan, and Sophia's voice would sometimes echo faintly in the background, guiding the conversation even when she was not directly part of it. At the time I had believed it was simply life moving forward, the natural distance that comes when children build their own homes, but sitting there now, surrounded by a version of family that had no space for me, I began to see the pattern not as coincidence but as design. I remembered the day they redecorated the living room, how Sophia had shown me pictures on her phone, explaining the concept with enthusiasm, and I had nodded along, complimenting her taste, even as I noticed how every piece that once held a memory had been replaced with something newer, cleaner, untouched by the past. She had said it was about creating a fresh start, and I had smiled, thinking that was a beautiful idea, not realizing that the past she was clearing away included me. Even Daniel's habits had changed in ways I had once ignored, the way he no longer asked for advice, the way he deferred decisions with a quick glance toward Sophia, as if checking for approval before answering. Small things that seemed harmless until they formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. I sat back slightly in my chair, letting my hands rest quietly against the table as these memories aligned themselves into something clearer, something I could no longer explain away as timing or circumstance. It was not that I had been pushed out all at once, it was that I had been gently, carefully moved aside over time, step by step, until the space I once occupied had been filled with something else entirely. And the most unsettling part was not the exclusion itself, but the way it had been done so politely, so reasonably, that I had thanked them for it without even realizing what I was losing. I looked at Sophia again, watching the ease with which she navigated the room, the quiet authority in her voice, and for the first time I understood that this had never been accidental, that every adjustment, every small change I had accepted without question, had been part of a larger intention, one that had brought us all to this exact moment, where I sat at the edge of a table that used to feel like home, finally seeing it for what it truly was. It was not until I reached for the serving spoon that someone finally noticed me in a way that felt real, not polite, not rehearsed but human, and it came from a voice I did not expect, a woman seated 2 chairs down, older than the rest, with a quiet presence that had gone unnoticed until that moment. "That dish," she said gently, leaning slightly toward me. "Did you make that yourself?" And I nodded, surprised by the simple question. The kind that used to be so ordinary it never stood out, but now felt almost foreign in a room where everything seemed curated except sincerity. "It smells like something my mother used to make," she added, her eyes soft with a kind of memory that did not need explanation, and for the first time that evening, I felt something shift in a different direction, not the heavy realization that had been settling inside me, but a small, unexpected warmth. "It is an old recipe," I replied, my voice steady. "My husband used to love it." And she smiled in a way that felt genuine, not performative, as if the words meant something beyond polite conversation. Sophia's voice cut in almost immediately after, light but firm, redirecting attention back to the center of the table, away from the edge where I sat, and I noticed how quickly the moment dissolved, how easily something real could be replaced by something controlled, and yet the brief exchange lingered with me longer than anything else that had been said that night. The woman did not push further, did not try to draw attention to me, but she did not look away either, and in that quiet acknowledgement, I found something I had not realized I needed, a confirmation that I was not invisible, not entirely. The conversation moved on as it always did, but I began to listen differently now, not as someone trying to belong, but as someone observing, collecting, understanding. I noticed how Sophia referred to the house as hers, not ours, how she spoke about future plans with a certainty that left no room for Daniel's voice, how she described changes as improvements, always framing the past as something that needed to be replaced, refined, elevated. I watched Daniel nod along, offering small agreements, his role reduced to affirmation rather than participation, and it became clearer with each passing minute that this was not just about me being out of place, it was about control, about shaping not just the environment but the narrative of what this family was and who had the authority to define it. The woman who had spoken to me earlier reached for the dish I had brought, serving herself a small portion despite the abundance of options on the table, and though she said nothing more, the gesture itself carried weight, a quiet refusal to follow the unspoken hierarchy that had been established. I realized then that not everyone at this table was entirely comfortable, that beneath the polished surface there were small fractures, moments where the performance did not quite hold, and those moments mattered more than any carefully chosen words. I rested my hands again, letting them remain still this time, no longer searching for something to do, because I was no longer trying to prove my place, and as I looked around the table once more, I understood something I had missed before, that influence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in the way people hesitate, in the way they glance at each other before speaking, in the way they choose silence over agreement. And in that understanding I felt a quiet clarity begin to form, not yet a decision, not yet a plan, but the beginning of something that would not require permission, something that would not depend on being included, something that belonged entirely to me. I did not speak for a while after that, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was beginning to understand that speaking too soon would only place me back into a role I had already outgrown. So instead I listened, not to the words themselves, but to the space between them, the pauses, the careful glances, the subtle shifts in tone whenever certain topics came up. Sophia began discussing a renovation project, something about expanding the back of the house, adding a sunroom, upgrading the kitchen further, even though it already looked like something out of a design magazine. And I noticed how she spoke as if the decisions had already been made, as if approval was a formality rather than a necessity. Daniel nodded along again, offering small comments that sounded more like echoes than opinions, and one of the guests asked casually how long they had owned the property, a simple question, but one that caused a brief, almost imperceptible pause. "A few years now," Sophia answered. Smoothly, her voice steady, but I saw the flicker in Daniel's expression, the way his eyes shifted for just a second before returning to his plate, and that was when something else began to take shape in my mind, something quieter but sharper than the realizations I had already had. I remembered the paperwork from months ago, the documents I had reviewed carefully at my dining table, the ones my husband had insisted be structured a certain way before he passed, not out of distrust but out of foresight, a protection he had quietly put in place without ever making it a burden. And I had honored that, signed where I needed to sign, updated what needed updating, never once imagining I would need to rely on it so soon. I had not mentioned it to Daniel, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I believed there would be time that conversations could happen naturally, respectfully, the way they used to in our family. But sitting there now, watching the way decisions were being presented as conclusions, not discussions, I realized that time had already been taken from me in ways I had not fully acknowledged. Sophia continued speaking, describing future plans with the same polished certainty, and I let her words pass over me without interruption, because I was no longer trying to correct her version of reality. I was simply noting it, storing it, allowing it to confirm what I was beginning to understand. The woman who had spoken to me earlier glanced in my direction again, just briefly, as if sensing the shift that had taken place, and I gave her a small nod, not to draw attention, but to acknowledge that I was no longer uncertain, no longer searching for clarity. I rested my hands calmly on the table, feeling a steadiness settle into me that had not been there when I first arrived, and for the first time that evening, I was not reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing, not in a dramatic way, not with anger or urgency, but with a quiet precision that came from knowing exactly where I stood. The room had not changed, the voices were still measured, the laughter still controlled, the atmosphere still curated to perfection, but something within me had shifted completely, and as Sophia outlined yet another plan for a future she believed she controlled, I realized that the only reason she could speak with such confidence was because she did not yet know the full truth, and the moment she did, everything she had built so carefully would begin to unravel, not loudly, not chaotically, but with the same quiet certainty she had used to push me aside, only this time the control would no longer be hers. By the time the plates began to clear, the rhythm of the evening had settled into something almost predictable, and that predictability gave me an advantage I had not expected when I first walked through the door, because once you understand the pattern, you begin to see where it breaks. Sophia moved through the room with the same careful precision, thanking guests, directing small transitions from dinner to dessert, her voice steady, her posture flawless, and I watched her the way one watches a performance that has been rehearsed too many times, noticing not just what she did, but what she avoided, the subjects she redirected, the questions she answered too quickly, the ones she chose not to acknowledge at all. Daniel stood beside her, holding a tray he did not need to hold, offering assistance that was not required, his role reduced to presence rather than participation. And I realized then that his silence was not new, it had simply become more refined over time. The woman who had spoken to me earlier rose from her seat, carrying her plate toward the kitchen, and as she passed behind me, she paused just long enough to place her hand lightly against the back of my chair, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for balance, but there was intention in it, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need words. I did not turn, I did not react outwardly, but I felt it, and it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that while the room may have been curated, it was not entirely controlled. I stood slowly, gathering my things with the same calm I had maintained all evening, not in preparation to leave, but in preparation to move, because staying in one place had already shown me everything I needed to see. I carried my dish into the kitchen, noticing how it had been pushed slightly to the side, untouched except for the small portion the woman had taken, and I allowed myself a brief, quiet moment of reflection, not on the rejection itself, but on what it represented, the way something made with care could be overlooked simply because it did not fit a certain image. Sophia entered the kitchen shortly after, her expression composed, her tone unchanged, and for a moment we stood in the same space without speaking, the distance between us filled with everything that had not been said. "You did not have to bring anything," she said lightly, her words framed as politeness but carrying the same underlying message I had heard when I arrived, and I met her gaze without hesitation this time, not with defiance but with clarity. "I know," I replied, my voice even, "but I wanted to." And that was the end of it, at least on the surface. She turned away first, returning to her role, to her guests, to the version of the evening she was maintaining, and I watched her go with a different understanding than before, not of who she was but of what she believed, and more importantly what she did not yet know. I returned to the dining room, taking my place again not because I needed to, but because I chose to, and as the conversation resumed around me, I no longer felt the need to follow it, to participate in it, to be shaped by it. Instead, I observed, measured, and waited, because there are moments when action matters, and there are moments when understanding matters more. And as I sat there, listening to the final pieces of the evening fall into place, I knew with quiet certainty that my moment was coming, not as a reaction but as a decision, one that would not be rushed, one that would not be influenced by their expectations, but one that would restore something they had already assumed was gone. And the more they spoke, the more certain I became that they had no idea what was about to change. The evening began to wind down in the way carefully planned evenings always do, with a gradual softening of voices and the subtle shifting of chairs, guests preparing to leave while still holding on to the illusion that nothing unusual had happened, and I remained seated just a moment longer than necessary, watching as coats were gathered and polite goodbyes were exchanged, each interaction measured, each smile placed exactly where it belonged. Sophia stood near the front door now, her posture still perfect, thanking each guest with a warmth that felt practiced, her tone consistent, her presence unwavering, and I noticed how easily she transitioned from one person to the next, never lingering, never allowing a conversation to drift into anything unplanned. Daniel followed her lead, opening the door, offering small gestures of courtesy, his role clear, supportive, secondary, and I realized that even in these final moments, the structure of the evening remained intact, controlled from beginning to end. I rose slowly, smoothing my coat over my shoulders, not in a hurry, not out of obligation, but because I had seen enough, understood enough, and there was no longer anything left for me to wait for. The woman who had spoken to me earlier paused beside me as she prepared to leave, her expression thoughtful, and for a brief second our eyes met again, her gaze steady, as if she recognized something had shifted, something important, and she gave a small nod before turning away. Silent acknowledgement that did not need explanation. I walked toward the entryway, my steps measured, my movements calm, and as I approached, Sophia turned toward me with that same composed expression she had maintained all evening. "It was nice to have you," she said. Her words polite but distant, as if I had been a guest rather than something more, and I met her gaze without hesitation, feeling none of the uncertainty I had carried when I first arrived. "It was," I replied, my voice even, allowing the words to stand on their own, because there was no need to correct her, no need to challenge the version of events she believed in. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, as if noticing something for the first time that he had overlooked all evening, and there was a flicker of something in his expression, not quite understanding, not quite concern, but enough to tell me that he sensed the shift even if he could not yet name it. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the quiet of the street a sharp contrast to the controlled warmth I had just left behind, and for a moment I stood there, letting the stillness settle around me, breathing in deeply, feeling the weight of the night begin to lift in a way that surprised me. I walked to my car. Without looking back, not out of anger, not out of hurt, but because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore, nothing that needed to be revisited or reconsidered. As I started the engine, the house remained visible in my rearview mirror, its lights glowing softly, its windows reflecting a version of family that had been carefully constructed, but no longer held any power over me. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, steady, certain, and in that quiet moment I made a decision that did not feel dramatic, did not feel rushed, but felt inevitable, something that had been forming long before this evening began, something that would not depend on their approval or their understanding, something that would quietly reshape everything they believed to be secure. I shifted the car into drive, pulling away slowly, the distance between us growing with each passing second, and as the house disappeared from view, I knew with complete clarity that while they believed the evening had ended exactly as planned, they had not yet realized that this was only the beginning of what would follow. I drove for a while without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle around me as the streetlights passed one by one, each one marking a little more distance between me and the version of the evening they believed had gone exactly as planned, and it was in that quiet that everything I had observed began to organize itself into something clearer, something no longer tied to emotion or memory but to fact. When I reached home, I did not go straight to bed the way I normally would after a long drive. Instead, I walked into my dining room, turned on the small lamp by the window, and sat down at the same table where I had reviewed the documents months ago, the same table where my husband and I had spent years discussing decisions that shaped our lives, and I allowed myself a moment to simply sit there, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of what I was about to do. I opened the drawer slowly, taking out the folder I had placed there after signing everything, the papers still neatly arranged, untouched since the day they had been finalized, and I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the top document, not to confirm its existence but to acknowledge its significance. I remembered the conversation with the attorney, the careful explanation of each clause, the emphasis on clarity, on protection, on ensuring that nothing could be misinterpreted or overlooked, and at the time, I had listened with the calm attention of someone who believed these were precautions, not necessities. Now sitting alone in the quiet of my home, I understood that they were both. I flipped through the pages slowly, reviewing details I already knew by heart, the ownership structure, the financial accounts, the conditions that had been put in place with a level of precision that left no room for assumption, and I realized that while I had spent the evening being quietly removed from a space I once belonged to, the truth was that nothing of value had actually been taken from me. It had simply been hidden beneath a narrative I had allowed to exist. I reached for the phone, not with urgency but with purpose, dialing a number I had saved months ago but had not needed to use until now, and when the line connected I spoke clearly, calmly, outlining what I needed, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a continuation of something that had already been set in motion long before that evening began. There was no anger in my voice, no trace of confrontation, only a steady clarity that came from knowing exactly where I stood and what I intended to do next. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat for a moment longer, allowing the stillness to return, and in that stillness, I felt something settle into place, not a sense of loss but a sense of alignment, as if the pieces that had been shifting all evening had finally found their proper positions. I closed the folder carefully, returning it to the drawer, not because it was no longer needed, but because its purpose had already been set into motion, and as I stood to turn off the light, I realized that the version of events they believed in, the one where I had quietly accepted my place at the edge and left without question, was already beginning to change in ways they could not yet see. I walked upstairs with a steady pace, not carrying anything with me except the certainty that what came next would not be driven by emotion or impulse, but by something far more precise, and as I turned off the final light and let the house fall into silence, I knew that while they would wake the next morning believing everything remained exactly as it was, the truth had already begun to move beneath the surface, and there would be a moment very soon when it would rise into view, and when it did, nothing they had assumed would remain untouched. The next morning arrived with a kind of stillness that only comes after a decision has already been made, not the restless kind that follows uncertainty, but a steady, grounded quiet that settles in when there is nothing left to question. I moved through my routine without interruption, pouring my coffee, opening the curtains just enough to let in the early light, and for a moment, everything felt exactly the same as it always had, except for one thing: the clarity that now guided each step, each thought, each action. I sat down at my desk again, not to review anything this time but to follow through, because understanding without action is just another form of delay. And I had already delayed enough. I reached for my phone and made the second call, the one that would not just confirm what had been set in motion, but activate it, the one that would turn structure into consequence. And when the voice on the other end answered, I spoke with the same calm precision as the night before, referencing specific accounts, specific authorizations, ensuring that everything aligned exactly as it was intended. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exchanges, only confirmations, acknowledgments, and the quiet sound of processes being initiated, processes that did not rely on emotion or interpretation, only on fact. When the call ended, I set the phone down and allowed myself a brief moment to breathe, not out of relief but out of recognition, because this was the point where everything shifted from internal understanding to external reality. Somewhere across town, in a house that had been carefully curated to reflect control and certainty, things would begin to change in ways that could not be smoothed over or explained away. Accounts that had once been accessible would no longer respond the same way, permissions that had been assumed would require verification, and questions that had never been asked would suddenly demand answers. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, not searching for anything but simply acknowledging the distance, not just in miles but in understanding. I knew that Daniel would notice first, not because he was more aware, but because the systems he relied on would no longer behave the way he expected, and I knew Sophia would respond quickly, attempting to correct, to control, to re-establish the narrative she had built so carefully. But this was not something that could be adjusted with a conversation or a smile. This was structure, this was documentation, this was the kind of truth that does not shift under pressure. I turned away from the window and returned to my desk, opening my calendar and marking the next step, not as a reaction but as a continuation, because what had begun the night before was never about that single evening. It was about everything that had led up to it and everything that would follow. I moved through the rest of the morning with the same steady pace, completing small tasks, answering messages, allowing life to continue as it always did, because control does not require disruption, it requires consistency. And as the hours passed, I knew that somewhere the first signs had already begun to surface, small at first, almost dismissible but undeniable, and with each passing moment, those signs would grow clearer, sharper, until the version of reality they had relied on would no longer hold. And when that moment came, it would not be loud, it would not be chaotic, it would be precise, undeniable, and irreversible. And for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting to be included in something, I was the one deciding what came next. It did not take long for the call to come, and when it did, it arrived exactly as I expected, not with anger at first, but with confusion, the kind that tries to disguise itself as control. I let the phone ring twice before answering, not to create tension, but to allow the moment to settle into its proper place. And when I picked up, Daniel's voice came through, tighter than usual, measured but strained beneath the surface. "Mom, something is wrong with the accounts," he said, and I could hear the hesitation behind his words, the quiet realization that something he thought was stable was no longer responding the way it should. "I noticed," I replied calmly, not offering explanation, not filling the silence that followed, because silence has a way of revealing more than words ever could. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that stretches just long enough for understanding to begin forming, and then Sophia's voice entered, not directly, but close enough that I could hear her. In the background, her tone sharper now, less polished, asking questions that were no longer part of a performance but part of a problem. "We cannot access the renovation funds," Daniel continued, his voice shifting slightly as if trying to maintain control over a situation he no longer fully understood. "And the authorization levels have changed. I need to know what is going on." I stood by the window as he spoke, looking out at the same quiet street as before, letting his words reach me without interruption, because this was not a moment for reaction, it was a moment for clarity. "Nothing is wrong," I said finally, my voice even. "Everything is exactly as it should be." The silence that followed was heavier this time, no longer uncertain but confrontational in a way that had not yet found its direction. "That does not make sense," Sophia's voice cut in now, no longer in the background, her control slipping just enough to reveal the urgency beneath it. "We have been managing these accounts for years, there must be some kind of mistake." I allowed a small pause before responding, not out of hesitation but out of intention, because timing matters when the truth is no longer something that can be softened. "You have been using them," I said. "But you have never been managing them." The shift was immediate, the kind that changes the direction of a conversation in a single moment, and I could almost hear the recalibration happening on the other end of the line. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now, the certainty gone, replaced by something else, something closer to understanding. I turned away from the window, resting my hand lightly on the back of the chair beside me, grounding myself in the same calm I had carried since the night before. "I am saying that the structure you assumed was yours was never transferred," I explained, not raising my voice, not adding emotion, only stating what had always been there. "And as of this morning, all permissions have been corrected to reflect that." There was no immediate response, only the sound of breathing, of processing, of something unraveling in a way that could not be reversed. "You should have told us," Sophia said finally, her voice lower now, controlled again but no longer confident, and I considered her words for a brief moment before answering. "You should have asked," I replied, and I let that settle between us, not as an accusation but as a fact. I ended the call shortly after, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to negotiate, and as I set the phone down, I felt the same steady certainty return, the same quiet understanding that had guided every step since that evening, because this was no longer about being included or respected or even acknowledged, this was about truth, structure and consequence, and as the reality of what had changed began to take hold on the other end of that line, I knew that the version of control they had built so carefully had already begun to collapse under the weight of something they had never taken the time to understand. The call I ended that morning was not the end of it, it was only the beginning of what they would be forced to face, because truth, once it is no longer hidden, does not stay contained, it moves, it spreads, and it reveals everything connected to it whether people are ready or not. By noon, the second wave had already reached them, not through me, but through the systems they had relied on without ever understanding: notifications, confirmations, requests for verification, each one small on its own but together forming a pattern that could not be ignored, and I knew exactly how it would unfold because I had already seen the structure, already understood where the pressure points were. The message from the legal office went out that afternoon, not dramatic, not accusatory but precise, addressed to all parties associated with the accounts and the property, outlining the current ownership status, the corrected authorization levels, and the immediate suspension of any activity that had not been formally approved, and there was no room for interpretation in that language, no space for charm or explanation, only fact. I did not need to be there to see it, but I could imagine the moment clearly, the way the email would be opened, the way the words would be read once, then again, slower the second time, the way understanding would settle in not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual collapse of everything they believed to be secure. Daniel called again, not with confusion this time, but with something closer to realization, his voice stripped of the certainty he had carried for so long, asking questions that no longer had simple answers, and Sophia, I was told, had tried to reach out separately, not to apologize, not to acknowledge, but to negotiate, to reframe, to regain control of a situation that no longer belonged to her. I did not respond immediately because response was no longer required. The structure itself was speaking now, the documentation, the legal confirmations, the financial restrictions, all working together with a clarity that did not need my voice to be heard. By the end of the day, the consequences had become visible beyond their home. Contractors who had been expecting payments were informed of delays, plans that had been presented as finalized were suddenly uncertain, and the version of success Sophia had carefully projected began to show its fractures, not through confrontation but through absence, through the quiet withdrawal of access and authority. The following morning, I attended the scheduled meeting at the legal office, not because I needed validation, but because I believed in completion, and when Daniel arrived, he looked different, not older, not weaker, but aware in a way he had not been before. His posture less certain, his words more deliberate, and for the first time in a long time, he listened without interruption as the attorney explained everything in clear, measured terms, the ownership, the trust, the conditions, the responsibilities, all of it laid out in a way that could not be dismissed or misunderstood. Sophia was there as well, composed at first, but the control she had relied on was no longer supported by anything real, and as the explanations continued, her silence grew heavier, no longer strategic but necessary. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I simply clarified what had always been true, that nothing had been taken from them, only returned to its proper place, that access had been assumed without understanding, and that assumption had consequences. There were no arguments after that, no dramatic reactions, only acceptance, slow, reluctant but undeniable, because truth once established does not require agreement to exist. I stood to leave shortly after, gathering my things with the same calm I had carried from the beginning, and as I walked past them, I did not feel anger, I did not feel vindication. I felt something far more complete, something that did not depend on their reaction or their recognition. I felt restored. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the kind that sharpens your senses and reminds you exactly where you are, and as I walked to my car, I understood with absolute certainty that the position I had been pushed out of had never truly been lost, it had only been obscured, and now with everything revealed, there was no longer any question of where I stood. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away not as someone who had been excluded, but as someone who had reclaimed everything that mattered, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to me, and a lesson they would not forget, because from that moment forward, the atmosphere they had tried so carefully to control would always carry the truth they could not escape, and I would never again need to ask where I belonged, because I had already taken it back.